So we've had a lot of health research or research in areas of biomedical publishing, but we haven't heard a lot about the role of patients in peer review and grant review until now, so good timing. So now we have Laura Forsythe talking to us about scientist, patient and stakeholder roles in research application review at PCORI.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here to wrap up this panel, and I will try to keep it interesting because I know we're getting very late in the afternoon at this point, but I do think this is a fascinating topic, so I'm thrilled to share it with you. I just want to highlight that myself, as well as many of my co-authors, are either current or former staff of PCORI or members of PCORI's Methodology Committee or Board of Governors. So you heard a little bit about PCORI earlier today, but I want to highlight that we were authorized as a funder of clinical comparative effectiveness research in the US in 2010. And PCORI's mission really is to improve healthcare decision-making for patients and those who help them make decisions. And we aim to do that by involving patients and the broader healthcare community in everything that we do, including review of applications for funding. So PCORI's merit review of applications is unique in two really important ways: the involvement of patients and other stakeholders as reviewers of every application, as well as a set of unique review criteria. So as part of a larger effort to evaluate the impact of PCORI's approach to reviewing and funding applications, this specific project aims to assess the contribution of different reviewer types to funding final review scores and funding decisions, and also to assess the relative importance of the PCORI review criteria. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about PCORI's review process. I do want to note that there's been some changes over time to the review process for specific funding opportunities or more recently, and I'm going to be telling you about the process that was relevant to the proposals that are included in this project. So PCORI recruits reviewers into three different roles: scientists, patients, which also includes caregivers and advocates, and then what we call other stakeholders, and this includes roles like clinicians, health systems leaders, insurers, and others. And there was 5 review criteria: impact of the condition on the health of individuals and populations, potential of the study to improve healthcare and outcomes, technical merit or scientific rigor, the patient-centeredness of the study, and finally the plan for engagement of patients and other stakeholders in the design and conduct of the study. And scientists were required to score all 5 of these criteria. Patients and other stakeholder reviewers were required to score the potential to improve healthcare, patient-centeredness, and engagement. So I want to help you understand our review process a little more. Applications come in and they go through a preliminary online phase where every application was reviewed by 2 scientists, 1 patient, and 1 stakeholder as a primary reviewer. And each of those reviewers gave criteria scores as well as an overall score on a scale from 1 for exceptional to 9 for poor. And then based on that overall review scores from that online phase, about the top half of applications go on to be discussed at an in-person panel discussion, where again, the panels are made up of scientists, patients, and other stakeholders at a ratio of about 2 to 1 to 1, and everyone on the panel gives each application a final overall score. Ultimately, funding decisions are made by our Board of Governors, which is a multi-stakeholder group. Those decisions are based heavily on the merit review input, as well as other factors like our organizational priorities and programmatic fit. So this particular study is a retrospective cross-sectional analysis of administrative data from the review process from 5 consecutive review cycles that happened 2013 through 2015. And we tested associations between the final overall scores and the criteria scores given by each reviewer type using linear regression models, and they were stratified by reviewer type. So we tested 3 separate models. We also tested associations between the funding decisions, yes, it was funded, or no, it wasn't, and criteria scores using a logistic regression model. And all of the models adjusted for aspects of which funding program the applications went to, the review cycle, and characteristics of the principal investigator in terms of their experience. So I'd like to share some descriptive statistics with you. This analytic sample includes 1,312 applications that were reviewed in the online phase by a total of 535 reviewers. For the overall score in the online phase, scientists rated the proposals slightly poorer than the patients and stakeholder reviewers. 635 of those applications were discussed at the in-person panel, and ultimately 121 of them were funded. The final overall score was 28 for funded applications on average, compared to a mean of 50.1 for the unfunded applications. Before I tell you about the findings from the linear regression models, I want to take a minute to tell you about changes in the overall review score among the preliminary reviewers. Across all reviewer types and all applications, there was a change in the overall score from the online phase to the final score in 56% of the cases, and it was a change of 2 points or more about a quarter of the time. Most of those changes were towards a poorer score, and while the mean change is larger for patients and stakeholders compared to scientists, at least 50% of each of the 3 reviewer types the score changed at least 50% of the time across all 3 reviewer types. And we find through a different series of analysis that agreement converged after the discussion across reviewer types. And so the details of that are beyond the scope of this brief presentation, but I think this is some important context to interpret the models that I'm going to share with you. So, I want to explain these linear regression models. I want to set it up because it's a little complex. On the right, you see 3 boxes that represent our 3 linear regression models, one for each reviewer type, and the dependent variable here is the final overall scores among reviewers of that type. And on the left, you will see boxes representing the criteria scores as scored by each of our 3 types of reviewers. Now, the details of these models with the effect sizes and p-values and all of that are in the program, but I want to focus on the main takeaways here. First, these arrows represent the significant associations across the 3 models, and there's 3 points I want to highlight. The first is that for each of our 3 reviewer types, their final overall scores were related to 1 or more criterion scores from each of our 3 reviewer types. So to say that differently, there's an arrow of every color, all 3 colors, going into each of the 3 boxes on the right. So there's a lot of associations across reviewer types here. The next thing I want to highlight that isn't showing up well on this screen is that the strongest predictor for each of the 3 reviewer types is technical merit as rated by the scientist. So the strongest factor in all 3 of our models was the scientist rating of technical merit. Oh, there it is. Well, this one works better. The third point I want to make is that all 3 reviewer types' ratings of the potential to improve healthcare and outcomes were important in all 3 of these models. And lastly, when we look at our logistic regression model to identify the criterion scores associated with our funding decisions, we have a similar setup with the criterion scores on the left here from the different types of reviewers. And these are the factors that were significant in the model. So each of these criterion scores were positively associated with the likelihood of being funded. And those were the scientist rating of potential to improve health. For some reason, it's covering up the second box there, which is technical merit as rated by the scientists, and the scientist rating of patient-centeredness. And then also significant were the patient and stakeholder ratings of the potential to improve healthcare and outcomes. And there's 2 things I want you to take away from this model, and that is, again, that there are ratings from all 3 of the reviewer types that are significant in this model. And secondly, again, the importance of all 3 reviewers' perceptions of the potential to improve healthcare as important in these models. So there's some limitations to highlight to help you interpret these results. Although PCORI assigns people into one of 3 reviewer types, we know that our reviewers often identify with multiple roles within one person, making it difficult to attribute the contributions of the review process to any one viewpoint. And at the time of this study, the patients and stakeholder reviewers were not required to score the technical merit and impact of the criterion, impact of the conditioned criterion. So we know less about their individual views on those concepts. And our regression models can't tell us about causal relationships, although they do help us identify important associations. And we can't identify every factor that goes into determining the funding decisions because, as I mentioned, it's really a constellation of factors heavily based on the merit review process as well as other factors like programmatic fit. And finally, when we think about generalizability to other review processes, we need to consider differences in approach across funders and across time. That being said, there's some important conclusions that we draw from this research. The PCORI merit review process brings together reviewers from diverse perspectives, and they help us identify the applications that best meet our criteria in terms of technical merit and also potential to improve healthcare decision-making. And we learned from these analyses that all 3 reviewer types contribute to the review scores and funding outcomes. We see that technical merit is important to all reviewer types and is critical to funding success, as is all 3 perspectives on the potential to improve healthcare and outcomes. And taken together, this information helps us determine that research application review can usefully incorporate non-scientist views, particularly when we're looking at near-term indicators like the application scoring and the funding decisions. Ultimately, our understanding of the impact of PCORI's approach to merit review will be in assessing the impact of these studies that we fund, particularly in terms of the speed of uptake of the findings into clinical decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Right, do we have any questions? We do. Great. Hi.
So this is a question for both the current speaker and the one from the NIH. Sorry, I forgot your last name. So, so we talk a lot about how the results of the founded research were being utilized and reported, and I wonder if there is any plan to incorporate some of the things that we discovered. For example, some of the sponsors routinely do not publish papers or routinely do not report results, and incorporate that into the decision of funding process to ensure that this become incentives. And what if you show patient that most of the research that you are participating in, or whatever the patient involved in the research, will not be utilized or shared? How will they feel about that?
Mm.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Thank you. And one of the things that PCORI is ultimately looking towards when we're talking about impact is to whom and how the results are disseminated, and going beyond just the scientific community. So dissemination plan is part of the overall research plan of the applications that were reviewed for this process. And so I think it's an important place where our patient and stakeholder reviewers do weigh in on that.
Although that is important, but I think the question was also pointing out the idea that if people hadn't played ball previously because they'd done a study funded by PCORI, but then they hadn't bothered to register the study, they hadn't shared their results and all of that, that you would penalise them this time round by saying, sorry, you didn't do it right last time. So are you doing anything along those lines? I think that was...
Yes.
That was yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And a relevant point here is that PCORI was authorized in 2010. We held our first review meetings in 2012. Okay. And so these awardees that we're talking about actually, at least for their PCORI study with this approach, very few of them have yet had the opportunity to demonstrate what they will do with the PCORI funds. So it is something that we're looking to in the future. And I will say part of our authorizing legislation as well is that all of the results of our funded studies are made available within 90 days of completion. And so PCORI has a translation center where, regardless of whether they're positive or negative results, those will be made publicly available. So PCORI has a role in that process as well.
Okay, great. So suddenly we have 3 questions.
Well, let me just say quickly about that, since the question was addressed to NIH as well, that a major part of the rigor and reproducibility initiative and the clinical trials initiative, which will start in January, is to ensure that the clinical trials are brought to completion with a publication and registration on ClinicalTrials.gov. So NIH is dealing with this problem.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, we have 6 minutes, 4 questions, hopefully some answers. So you're going to have to make it snappy.
Okay, I will restrict this. I actually had a few questions, but I'll restrict this. So technical merit affected all reviewer types, but only the scientists were actually rating technical merit. So was that affecting it before or after they got the input? In other words, did the 2 other groups change their grading of this particular grant after they heard what the scientists had to say about it?
Yeah, so we don't know what in particular might drive people to change their overall score from the online phase to after the in-person discussion. But I suspect that is one element, because the 3 groups, after they score the proposals independently on the online phase, come together, and one of the things they heard was the scientists' explanation of their rating of technical merit. And so I think that's one way in which we see how people value that input and put it together with some of the other criteria, is the change of scores from when they scored alone to after the discussion.
Okay, yeah, both in that mic there, yes, and then.
Theo Bloom, BMJ, and a quick question from Twitter and for those of us jet-lagged in the room. I think you talked about scores getting lower after discussion. Was lower good or bad?
They move generally to be towards a poorer score after discussion.
And NIH, when you said the scores were bunched together at one end of the scale and not at the other, were those good scores or bad scores?
They're bunched at the good end.
Okay. I think there was some confusion about which numbers meant which. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes. Okay, and then it was, and then.
Mesiha Kagnjo from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was wondering about the patients. Are they suffering from the disease, or they are a general patient population?
Great question. So the patients on the panel will represent a variety of groups. One thing that's an opportunity and a challenge with PCORI's merit review compared to a study section in NIH is that our review panels are covering a much wider range of disease conditions, therapeutic areas on any one panel. And so the review group does their best to match up applications to people who are affected in some way or might be affected by that condition or a similar one, although there's certainly some matchups where the patients might have a more similar condition than the exact one of study. But these are people who have the condition, are at risk of the condition, or maybe care for someone with the condition.
Thank you. Thanks. So there is time for the last question. Great. Thanks.
Evan Mayo Wilson, Johns Hopkins. I think PCORI's done a tremendous job of raising the importance of patient-centeredness in research, and my question is whether having a few people involved in the grant review is really enough to do what we want to be done here, which is to generate outcomes and things that really matter to patients, and whether you've considered going further and saying, for instance, if you're doing a clinical trial, you should use a core outcome set or demonstrate that one isn't available, or use other methods to more systematically include patients in a broader and more representative way.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. What I didn't get into here is the role that patients and other healthcare stakeholders play beyond the review of applications. So you heard that one of the criteria is the plan for engaging patients and stakeholders. So every project has various approaches, but involvement of people who are affected by or treating or managing the condition involved in planning and designing the study. I think a key way that we're learning that those partners are affecting the contribution of the studies is in selecting the outcomes that will be studied and the ways that they will be measured. So one of the things that PCORI is doing is looking at what outcomes are measured in our whole portfolio of studies. I think it will point us in the direction of some core outcome sets. I think maybe that's the future once we have a robust portfolio of studies that have had patients and those who are caring for them involved in the design. But you're right, it's much beyond just the review process. It's in setting up the studies, it's in disseminating the findings, and ultimately in feeding back to PCORI how we can go about doing this whole enterprise a little differently.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.